In early 1988, 28-year-old wildlife enthusiast Julie Ward embarked on a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Africa. Her excursion was supposed to last for 6 months, but when it came time for her return home to England, she never boarded her flight. When her father, John Ward, was unable to reach Julie, he boarded a flight to Kenya and traveled to the Masai Mara Game Reserve in search of her. John hoped that his daughter was just stranded somewhere in the reserve, but on the 13th of September, his optimism would be destroyed when he discovered his daughter's charred remains scattered around a campfire. Kenyan officials bizarrely stated that Julie Ward's death was a result of a lightning strike, but the reality was much darker. From murder to an alleged government cover-up, Julie Ward's death is shrouded in mystery. Join us as we delve into her story and try to uncover the disturbing truth. Born on April 20th, 1960, in Suffolk, England, Julie enjoyed a comfortable and happy upbringing with her 2 brothers and parents, John and Jeanette Ward. After finishing school, Julie got a job at a publishing company. The job was extremely demanding, and it is reported that she often worked 15-hour days just to meet deadlines. Despite work taking up the majority of her time, Julie pursued wildlife photography, traveling all over the UK to photograph its wildlife. But in February 1988, Julie decided she wanted a change of pace. 15-hour workdays were slowly starting to grate on her, and she felt that she didn't have enough time for herself or her passions. Julie was scared life was passing her by, and she wasn't prepared to let that continue. Following this revelation, she decided to take a gap year in order to pursue her passion for wildlife photography. Later that month, Julie, along with a group of 26 other wildlife enthusiasts, left the UK for Morocco. Over the course of the next few months, the group traveled through Algeria, Mali, Ghana, the Ivory Coast, and Burkina Faso. The last stop on the trip was the one Julie was most excited about, Nairobi, Kenya. Julie was looking forward to photographing wildebeests in the Masai Mara National Reserve in Kenya, and it was all she talked about for weeks before her trip. But little did she know the place she was so desperate to visit would be the very place where her life would come to a tragic end. By September 5th, 1988, Julie had been in Kenya for several weeks and was thoroughly enjoying her time. Just days before she was due to fly home to England, Julie was introduced to Dr. Glenn Burns, a prominent Australian biologist. Julie became aware that, much like herself, Glenn Burns was very eager to witness the wildebeest migration to Masai Mara, and so the two agreed to go together. In early September, Glenn and Julie met and drove over 5.5 hours from the heart of Nairobi to the Masai Mara Reserve. After a grueling drive, the pair arrived at the Sand River campsite, assembled their tents, and then made themselves comfortable for their stay. The next morning, the duo woke bright and early, jumping into their SUV and driving out into the park. They spent most of the day photographing wildlife and talking about their lives back home. Just as they were beginning to wrap up for the day, their SUV broke down. Julie and Glenn were now stranded in the middle of the Masai Mara Reserve, a park that covers over 580 square miles. Luckily for them, Steve Watson, a safari tour guide, spotted their broken down vehicle and swooped in to help. Steve drove Glenn and Julie to the Serena Lodge and set them up for the night while they discussed their next move. Glenn had to be back in Nairobi for the 4th of September, and Julie's flight back home was also just a few days away, so neither of them really had the time to sit around and wait for their vehicle to be fixed. Glenn tried to convince Julie to fly back to Nairobi with him and stay in a hotel until she could get an earlier flight home or explore the city while waiting for her original flight. But Julie was not one to back down from her dreams and insisted that she wanted to stay in the park while she still had the opportunity. On September 4th, 1988, Glenn left Julie and departed for Nairobi. Julie stayed at the lodge and waited for a mechanic to fix the SUV. Thankfully, Julie didn't need to wait long, and by the evening of September 5th, the car was fixed thanks to the mechanic. Julie told Steve the following morning, September 6th, 1988, she planned to drive to the Sand River campsite collect her things, and then drive to Nairobi to catch her flight. It is believed that Julie did, in fact, stop at the Sand River campsite, but after this, her movements are unknown. Julie's flight from Nairobi to England was due to leave soon after she left the park, but Julie never stepped on the plane. On September 10, 1988, John Ward called his daughter to finalize her plans and tell her he would collect her from the airport. Following several missed calls, John called the lodge she was staying at, only to find that Julie was not there. John also called Julie's friends in Nairobi, who revealed she was not there earlier. In fact, nobody had heard from her since September 6th, when she parted ways with Steve Watson. A sick feeling washed over John. His beloved daughter had been missing for 4 days. It was extremely out of character for Julie to be out of contact with her friends and family. He made calls to local hospitals, but no patients named Julie Ward had been admitted. On September 12, 1988, 6 days after his daughter was last seen, John Ward arrived in Nairobi. The city Julie had described so gleefully was now a maze of nightmares for John, thinking that his daughter could be down any street or behind any door. From Nairobi, John made the grueling 5.5-hour drive to the Masai Mara National Park and began to search for his daughter. The Ward family was considered well off, as John's job as a hotel owner had netted the family a generous wealth. As a result of his wealth, John had the means to hire a helicopter and 5 planes to fly over the reserve and look for his daughter. Whilst the pilots took to the skies, John drove over every inch of the park using a standard grid search system. He was joined by park staff and others who caught wind of Julie's disappearance. One day after John had arrived in Nairobi, he discovered the first clue of his daughter's disappearance. Her SUV, which had previously broken down days earlier, was found abandoned in a gully close to the Sand River campsite. As John approached, his stomach sank. SOS had been written in mud on the roof, but the car was empty. The local police were summoned to the scene, but, as in the theme of this case, they showed major discontent for Julie and her disappearance. John, the volunteers, and the pilots put in far more effort than the local police. They scoured every inch of the park whilst the police tottered around as if time was on their side. The discovery of her abandoned car spurred John on further, but he knew that things were not looking good. Hours after Julie's abandoned SUV was found, the group made another shocking discovery. After trawling the long grass, a searcher came across a recently burnt-out campfire. Hoping for the best, John rushed to the scene, but his hopes were quickly dashed. Upon further inspection, the fire contained several human limbs and a jawbone. Parts of the victim's hair remained intact, and John immediately knew it was his daughter. John and a group signaled for the police, who were sluggish in their response. The crime scene contained only the limbs. There was no blood or tissue, and no sign of a struggle. Days after the first remains were found, Julie's skull was found in the bushes near the fire pit. The Kenyan police told Julie's family that she had been struck by lightning and her remains had been ravaged by animals. Disturbingly, the coroner who performed Julie's autopsy would record a verdict of homicide, only to allegedly be told by police that they would not be accepting this version of events. It was later claimed that a higher-up changed the report and verdict despite never having handled the remains themselves. They insisted that Julie had not been murdered and that she had been attacked by animals and struck by lightning. In their initial report, the coroner believed that Julie had been deceased just 12 hours before her remains were discovered. So where had she been? If she had been in the park, she would have been spotted by the game wardens, tour operators, tourists, and park rangers. But nobody saw her after she left Steve Watson on September 6, 1988. The fire in which Julie's body had been burned had been set with petrol. So why were the police so insistent that she had been hit by lightning? Julie's leg that was found in the fire pit had been severed with a blade, and the cut was clean. This is not what would be expected if her body had been ravaged by animals. John Ward quickly realized he would receive no help from the Kenyan authorities, and chose to transport his daughter's body back to England, where two independent pathologists reviewed Julie's remains and concluded that her leg and head had been hacked off with a sharp blade. A year after Julie's body was found, the Kenyan government opened an inquest into her death. Initially, the police ran with their initial findings that Julie was killed by lightning and animal activity. However, this quickly came under fire. The coroner who had performed the autopsy and made the first report admitted that his superior had changed the report. As part of the inquest, John Ward was subjected to 28 days of cross-examination. Every aspect of his and Julie's lives were ripped apart, and police even tried to say that Julie took her own life and threw herself into the fire. As evidence was presented on both sides, the tides began to change. The Kenyan and British public were heavily invested in the case and started demanding answers. Following months of evidence and testimonies, the judge at the inquest accepted that Julie Ward had been murdered. Disturbingly, he stated he saw no further need for investigation and the case was to be closed. John Ward left the inquest feeling more frustrated than before. The Kenyan authorities had now accepted his daughter had been murdered, but saw no reason to investigate. Why? In 1990, John Ward requested the help of the Metropolitan Police, who he also accused of withholding and misdirecting evidence. Earlier that year, John claims he was told by a British civil servant, quote, not to rock the boat and leave it to the Kenyans. John was infuriated by what he was hearing and continued to push the Metropolitan and the Kenyan police for answers. Shortly after the Metropolitan Police arrived in Kenya, they named two suspects, Peter Kapine and Jonah Magiroy. The pair worked at the Messiah Park and were to become scapegoats. In February 1992, the trial of Peter and Jonah commenced, with opening arguments being presented. During the trial of Peter and Jonah, it was revealed that a critical piece of evidence had been forged. On September 6, 1988, Julie had signed out of the Sand River camp's guest log. This was a crucial piece of evidence in confirming Julie's last moments, but it had all been a lie. David Nunchako, another park ranger, admitted to forging her signature. The trial was a sham from the beginning, and after several months, the pair were acquitted of all charges. John told the media he never believed these two rangers killed his daughter, and he knew the real killer remained free. Several years after the trial of Jonah and Peter took place, Simon McCullough found himself on trial. Simon McCullough had been the park ranger who led John Ward to the remains of his daughter, which made him immediately suspicious. The remains were far away from her car, and the park covered a large area, so how did Simon suddenly stumble across her remains? Again, several months of intense questioning and cross-examination would occur, but in September 1999, Simon McCullough was found not guilty. But John remained adamant that McCullough was involved in his daughter's murder. At this point, it was clear in John's mind that there was some sort of cover-up or corruption at play. What came next would only reaffirm that belief. In the early 2000s, rumors began to swirl that Jonathan Moi, the son of then Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi, was the one who murdered Julie. A witness came forward and claimed that he had witnessed Julie's murder and was threatened into silence. Jonathan Moi was described as a, quote, playboy, happy to spend his money on lavish entertaining and indulging his fondness for rally driving. John Ward later told the Daily Mail that he was first made privy of this rumor when he was approached by a woman in Nairobi. She got close to John before stuffing a note in his palm which read, "The man who killed your daughter is Jonathan Moi." This is when things finally clicked into place for John. He believed the police had not covered up the murder because it was bad for tourism, but because it implicated the son of a very powerful and ruthless leader. As these rumors began to circulate more widely, Jonathan Moi and his father, Daniel, publicly denied all accusations made against them. But John Ward remained certain that Jonathan Moi was involved in his daughter's death. So much so that, in the years that followed, John made hundreds of visits to Kenya, spent millions of pounds, and pressed the Kenyan police to retrieve a DNA sample from Jonathan Moy to put the rumors to bed once and for all, but this request was repeatedly denied. John would later implicate the Metropolitan Police and MI6 for being complicit in the cover-up of his daughter's murder. It is believed that a scandal of this size may have threatened diplomatic relations between the two countries and may have changed the public's opinion of Kenya. Daniel Moi held extreme power during his time as president, and many who dissented against him disappeared. He is said to have funded and run rebel camps, one of which was in the Masai Mara Park. One theory is that Julie unknowingly uncovered this camp and was attacked to ensure her silence. In June 2023, both Janet and John Ward passed away within just 2 weeks of each other. The pair were 89 years old and had shared 65 wonderful years of marriage. Their sons, Bob and Tim, were planning a joint 90th birthday celebration for them later that year. Despite his old age and ailing health, John never gave up his search for the truth. In 1991, he published a book titled The Animals Are Innocent: The Search for Julie's Killers. Shortly after his death, a second book was in the works, and his sons hoped to publish it posthumously. Whilst the Kenyan and British governments have now accepted that Julie Ward was murdered, nobody has ever been brought to justice. John Ward strongly believed that Jonathan Moy either murdered or was directly involved in the crime. The prevailing theory is that a group of men found Julie in the park, sexually assaulted her, and murdered her before dumping her body in a place they believed it would never be found. Julie's case runs extremely deep, and until Kenyan authorities agree for DNA samples to be taken and tested, Julie's case will remain unsolved. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out our documentary on Daniel LaPlante. It's incredibly disturbing.